was just on talking about the new traffic cameras and all the controversies related to the implementation of those. 20,000 tickets at $95 issued in about 2.5 months. I want to welcome on Colin Reed, big time Washington consultant, formerly worked for Scott Brown and a whole host of other folks down in DC. Colin, are you part of the swamp? Do you count as part of the swamp?
Well, New England's always been my home, Josh, but I guess technically, yes. I am firmly ensconced in the swamp now.
Congratulations. You are one of those people. Every week we have Jennifer Lawless, professor over at American University, on, and we usually have a couple other of you smart DC folks. And I really want to welcome you. You've got a lot of insights and been down there and have some real expertise. Let's start off by talking about Congressional Race 18, District 18 in Pennsylvania, probably a congressional district that no one has ever talked about in the history of politics before the last 2 or 3 months. It's actually a district that'll be going away because it's been declared a illegal district, and I believe the Supreme Court down there in Pennsylvania is redrawn the lines. But it is the battleground of Republicans and Democrats right now, and it looks like a lock solid Republican seat that even a Democrat didn't run in the last two cycles is going to turn from red to blue. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right, Josh. I mean, this seat will cease to exist come November. So when the history books are all written, I think this will largely be a blip, albeit a very expensive blip on the radar. And there's no doubt about it. It's not a good night for Republicans when they're having to fight and claw it out and go to a recount in a district that the president won by 20 points 2 years ago. So there's warning signs. And I think the NRCC chairman, Steve Stivers, has been out there today warning his members that this is indeed a wake-up call. But I do think that Democrats would be remiss if they looked to this race as a blueprint for how they can win across the country. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, their candidate, Connor Lamb, who credit where credit's due, he ran a very good race, but he ran essentially as a Republican light. Denounced Pelosi. He praised Donald Trump. He ran as not only someone who was a pro-gun candidate, he ran as someone who featured an assault weapon that many members of his party are trying to ban in a campaign commercial. And that's just those aren't the things that a Democratic candidate can do across the country who face primary challenges. So, I think last night was a wake-up call for the Republicans, but I don't think it's something the Democrats can look to and say, okay, now we've got our recipe for success in other places across the country.
There are a lot of districts that swing. Their purple districts 2 or 3 points either way from Republican or Democrats. Is potentially Connor Lamb the model that you want to clone if you're Democrats to be able to run across the country? That you can't be a Bernie Sanders Democrat and in these fringe swing districts really be able to beat anybody on a significant level. Isn't that the takeaway for Democrats, that they've got to find more mainstream candidates? Connor Lamb could be a Republican. In Rhode Island,
right,
he would be a conservative Republican.
Oh, yeah. In places where you and I are from, if you're running as a Republican, you have to do the opposite of what Connor Lamb did in Pennsylvania,
Right.
Which is what you can to take his way as many of the kind of wedge issues the other side will use against you. And if you're a Republican running in New England, you got to run as someone who's strong on the environment, who's strong on gun control, who's strong on issues that the Democrats like to run against Republicans on in the blue parts of the country. And Connor Lamb did the reverse of that in Pennsylvania. But look, if you look across the country, down in Houston right now, there's another competitive House race where the Democrats have a large field that they've got running against John Culberson in the 7th Congressional District in Houston, one of these candidates was openly attacked by the Democratic establishment here in D.C. for being too unelectable. So it's kind of the reverse Tea Party in a number of ways.
Right.
We saw it in 2010 and 2012 on the Republican side in primaries. It's now happening on the Democratic side. And what happened in Houston was a huge disaster for the Democrats because it led to this inter-party warfare between the Bernie Sanders crew and the so-called establishment. So the model works if their base and their primary voters will let them. But I don't think they will, because the party is run by the likes of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, more so than the middle of the roaders who would be willing to cut compromises to elect good candidates.
Listen, you work for Scott Brown. You're a key part of his team. Let's talk about Elizabeth Warren. This past weekend, a couple of things happened that were newsworthy. One, she refused Chuck Todd's request, and he wasn't the first one to suggest it, that she take a DNA test and put this whole issue of whether or not she's a Native American to rest. This issue has come up throughout her entire career. There are those who claim that she got benefits in her teaching positions because she claimed to be a Native American. Our own Bob Whitcomb, columnist, has suggested the same, that, listen, get past this issue, it's just burdensome. And with Chuck Todd, she ducked and dodged. It reminded me of a rope-a-dope that I had seen Muhammad Ali do against George Foreman back in the battle in Zaire, I think it was. Does she have to address this issue at some point?
A couple of things on Elizabeth Warren. Number one, I found her answers on Sunday about whether she's running for president, I found them very Clinton-esque. She basically said, I am not currently running for president in the current tense.
Right.
Of course, leaving herself plenty of wiggle room if she decides to run down the road. But the other point is this issue for her, if she fails to find a convincing answer, something that's going to clear the decks and put it to rest once and for all, she risks running the way Hillary Clinton did with her vote for the Iraq War.
Right.
It was something she just couldn't shake, and it followed her around. Or whether, Secretary Clinton's email problems in the most recent campaign. In politics, the best thing to put these questions to rest is to answer them once and for all. But when the truth is so bad, you can't do that, that's when it lingers. And voters are pretty willing to forgive if you admit error, accept responsibility, and ask for forgiveness. But that's something that Senator Warren has not done. And, the whole DNA test and the name calling, I think it kind of misses the mark in many ways, because it's never been about whether or not she's Native American. It's whether or not she used that claim to get a professional advantage she wasn't entitled to.
Right.
And if she really wants to put that question to rest, she could authorize the release of all her employment applications to all the schools she worked at, and it would say whether or not she was Native American. But she would never do that. And she's the one who has the ability to put the question to rest. I just don't think she wants to.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump to her response to Chuck Todd's question about, is she running for president in 2020? Obviously, listen, there's lots of points of views on who's the perfect Democrat. It's pretty clear right now that the Democrats do not have a strategy for the 2020 election that anybody, certainly in the media, is able to decipher. Let's talk about her. Is she really a viable, listen, you've worked up here in New England. We live in New England. She's a prolific fundraiser. No two ways about it. You saw the weight of her fundraising ability against Scott Brown in Massachusetts. The combination of the two of them, I think, raised close to $90 million. Let's talk about her. Is she really the type of candidate that Americans are going to support in a Democratic primary and then in a general election?
Well, in a Democratic primary, I think she would have a strong lane of support. I think the complicating factor potentially for her is another New Englander, and that's Senator Bernie Sanders. He's someone who, although he refuses to register or identify as a Democratic member of the Democratic Party, he ran and got more than 12 million votes in 2016. And he's everywhere on TV. He's prolific in terms of maintaining his presence. So by all accounts, it appears as though he's going to run again. So Senator Sanders and Senator Warren would occupy a similar lane in a primary in terms of getting that far left lane. So they'd be splitting their own votes. But the other thing that I think has flown a bit under the radar staying here in New England is former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick.
Yeah.
Also has very much left the option of running for president on the table. He is someone who quite challenges during his 2 terms on Beacon Hill. He left with high approval ratings. He's a gifted campaigner, and he's someone else who I don't think can be taken too lightly. Although he now works at Bain Capital, which, as you remember from 2012, was quite a boogeyman for the Democrats in their campaign against Mitt Romney. So
Yeah,
that would be.
absolutely. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Deval Patrick. Clearly, he had worked in corporate America before he became governor. I think he was chief legal counsel at Coca-Cola, I think, or one of the major corporations. Served on many national corporate boards. Was a prolific fundraiser. Is that a swing back towards? And I don't just mean for racial reasons, but also ideology, political connections. They were good friends. Is that a swing back to Barack Obama? Is that saying, hey, listen, we did pretty well under Obama. He was a candidate that could bring folks together. Maybe Deval Patrick could as well.
Yeah, and they do share some of the same political advisors, and so it's a fair comparison to make on a number of levels. I think Governor Patrick could do well in a primary. I do think his Bain connections could be problematic, and that's through the lens of a Democratic primary voter because Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have dragged this party so far to the left. Who can forget how Hillary Clinton's paid speeches to Wall Street banks? That was a political liability in 2016 when the party's only moved further to the left since then. So he'd have a similar challenge there. But it gets to a larger point, Josh, which is the field is so wide open. It could be in 2020 for the Democrats. Could be, again, we were talking about how the Tea Party has kind of come from the Republicans to the Democrats. They could have what we had in 2016, which is a huge crowded primary field where many, many different qualified people are competing for the same slice of pie. And it's a jump ball as to who emerges. And one of the reasons that Donald Trump was able to move so successfully through the 2016 Republican primary is because he had that lane all to himself while everybody else was fighting for the same scrap of voters. So I think a lot of what's going to play out is going to be based on who all is in the race in that regard.
Let's just, is there a mainstream Democrat, regardless if he can win the primary, who certainly would be better suited for a general election? Is there anybody emerging from these governors, state houses across the country, a former senator, anybody like that, that is starting to percolate, is starting to do those trips to Iowa and New Hampshire, that could be more like a Bill Clinton, a more mainstream, perceived to be kind of pro-business Democrat?
You know, the obvious name who comes to mind is former Vice President Joe Biden.
Right.
It keeps popping up, although he'd be close to 80 in 2020. Although I guess in today's political age, 80 may be the new 60. Who knows?
Yeah.
But again, would he have a free lane to the primary? I don't think so. He would have 4 decades of votes he's taken in the Senate. And as someone who comes from the research world, it's very easy to go through reams and reams of roll call votes and find things that are politically unpopular and make them problematic in a primary.
Sure.
But one other of the trends, in addition to it being a very crowded field, is that most of the leading contenders right now for the Democratic nomination, they come from either the Northeast or the West Coast. There are not a lot of strong challengers emerging from the Midwest or from those quote unquote flyover states.
Yeah.
And, you know, getting to the White House at its core, it's about math. And it's about getting to 270 electoral votes. And Donald Trump's path in 2016, it went through states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan. He turned states red that hadn't been red in 25 years.
Right.
Unfortunately, our home state, you know, where I come from and where you come from, they're never going to be political battlegrounds, at least for the immediate future. Maybe New Hampshire, but even that's getting really blue. So if the Democrats were looking at a way to deprive Donald Trump of his 270 electoral votes that he's going to need to get reelected, I think they should be looking at some of those states in the middle of the country. And right now, it appears they don't really have any strong contenders from that part of the world.
Will the Republicans listen? It's been an amazing 2-year cycle, right? The election was in November 2016, and literally the energy around politics has not let up for a nanosecond. This is a very unusual situation. News consumption's high. Listen, we benefit from it as a news organization. I'm sure the busyness of that you're having is at a much higher pace than an off-year midterm election cycle. Let's just talk a little bit. We're going to be on the midterms in a matter of just a few months. We're going to be almost immediately out of it right into a presidential campaign. Is Donald Trump going to see a significant campaign challenge in the Republican primary from a viable Republican?
I don't think so, barring any sort of bombshell that comes out of the Mueller investigation or a change of heart from President Trump. He's been pretty clear, going back to the day he was inaugurated, that he intends to run for re-election.
Yeah.
And the approval ratings, while they have struggled with swing and middle-of-the-road voters, they've remained very strong with Republican primary voters. So if I were a betting man, I would say no.
Okay. And if he did see someone, you know, a Jeff Flake or somebody like that, I don't know if that's a viable one, but one of these pushed aside, more moderate Republicans who wants to go back to a little bit more mainstream Republican values and offer a more stable alternative. If that person picked up some energy, would he jump to be a third party candidate and really make a mess of the two parties?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think as both parties have moved further to their respective left and right, that there have been folks in the middle who have not found, who've been unable to kind of find a home that they're comfortable with. And where that goes, I don't know. Right now, the two parties have a pretty firm grasp on things, but you could see at some point down the road more of a middle of the road block forming. But it wouldn't just be Republicans; it would also be Democrats.
Yeah.
Because it would be the people who are uncomfortable with socialists like Bernie Sanders or extremists like Elizabeth Warren becoming the leaders of their party as well. And, you know, I think those two have kind of co-opted the ideas and the ideology, and certainly the energy of the base is behind people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. But if they fully took over the reins of power, then I think you could see kind of a disaffected middle block forming. But I think it would come from both parties, not one or the other.
Listen, I appreciate it, Colin. Super insightful. There's been so much change at the White House. When does your number come up? You've got to have a stint over there at the Trump White House.
No, I'm very happy sitting here talking to you, Josh.
It doesn't get better than that, but not a chance of being, let's see, what's open today? Commerce is full. State has now been replaced. CIA, I guess, it's moving chairs all the time.
I tell you, I'd like to go visit my old boss, Scott Brown, who's the ambassador to New Zealand, but that'll be on a vacation purposes only.
I think that should be a business trip. GoLocal would be happy to accompany you.
Yeah.
We'll talk to our friends over at TF Green and see if we can get a direct flight to New Zealand. Maybe we'll stop in Hawaii just for some rest on the way, hit Fiji for a couple days. But I think that's a very good point. We should head down there, fact-finding mission, to be able to find out directly from Scott Brown what the issues are down in that area of the Pacific.
And make sure the people of New Zealand get to experience some Narragansetts. I don't believe their distribution goes that far, so we could do that as well.
That's great. Hey, listen, Colin, thanks so much for Skyping in. We hope we can get you on a regular basis. This year is, nonstop politics. We've got Bob Flanders coming on in about 20 minutes, and stay tuned for that one. He's taken a pretty good shot at Sheldon Whitehouse on his votes and investments on opiate manufacturers. So that should be interesting. But hopefully we can get you back in the near term. Thanks so much for Skyping in.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you. We'll be right back in about 2 seconds. Let's call it 25 seconds with folks from Commerce RI talking about a really big economic initiative with the Volvo races stopping. Their only U.S. stop is in Newport, Rhode Island. Big numbers coming out of Spain where they just were, where they fueled about 100 million euros into the Spanish economy. So we'll be right back.